Unemployment and depression, the vicious cycle created by the CCP's extractive institutions. Jersey News Commentary Channel. China's most serious problem today is no longer simply economic collapse, nor is it merely an ordinary employment crisis. Rather, it is a comprehensive survival crisis engulfing society as a whole, one increasingly concealed beneath statistical rhetoric, propaganda rhetoric, and grand political narratives. Recently, the 2025 China Blue-Collar Employment Research Report was released, and, as usual, some people immediately began whitewashing reality. We hear phrases like steady upgrading of blue-collar employment, vigorous development of new forms of employment, and the rise of skilled blue-collar workers. It all sounds like a scene of prosperity and upward momentum. But once the layer of gold dust deliberately applied by official propaganda is shaken off, what emerges is a grim picture of unemployment, underemployment, low income, instability, insecurity, and hopelessness. The so-called upgrading of blue-collar employment is nothing less than a complete deception. The key issue is not whether the quality of employment has improved. The real question is whether the overall volume of employment has already collapsed. The fact that a small minority of workers have entered industries such as new energy maintenance, intelligent manufacturing, or automation maintenance does not prove that China's employment structure is advancing upward. In reality, all of the so-called new occupations promoted by officials amount to, at most, only 2 or 3 million jobs combined. Meanwhile, the number of unemployed and semi-unemployed people has already exceeded 300 million. This is the difference between a drop of water and an ocean. Using 1,000th or 1% of isolated phenomena to claim that the entire labor market is upgrading is, statistically speaking, a case of overgeneralization. In economics, it is called a compositional fallacy. In political propaganda, it is nothing less than a 100% lie. What is truly happening in China today is not an employment upgrade, but rather unemployment being cosmetically repackaged through statistics. China's National Bureau of Statistics is essentially trying to dress up a frail old woman as a glamorous young girl. A person who works 1 hour a week can be counted as employed. A university graduate who delivers a few takeout orders in a week can be counted as employed. A middle-aged person who loses a stable job and begins driving for a ride-hailing platform, having work one day and none the next, is still counted as employed. A housewife who works a few hours of temporary labor, a migrant worker from the countryside doing occasional moving jobs, or an unemployed white-collar worker who happens to sell a few items in a live stream, all of them are statistically categorized as employed. And so, unemployment disappears. And so, the unemployment rate remains permanently around 5%, almost unchanged for 4 decades. Not because unemployment has vanished, but because it has been covered with makeup and renamed flexible employment. This is a classic case of what can only be called linguistic corruption. Even more absurdly, flexible employment has been packaged as the new economy, a new employment model, or freelancing. Some scholars even argue, doesn't the United States also have flexible employment? Doesn't the West also have a gig economy? China has it, America has it, therefore, there is no problem. This is yet another shameless act of conceptual substitution. What does flexible employment mean in the United States? It includes doctors, lawyers, designers, consultants, programmers, real estate agents, registered nurses, accountants, project contractors, and many other professional occupations alongside, of course, a smaller number of delivery workers, ride-hailing drivers, and retail service jobs. America's flexible employment structure includes a large number of professional, voluntary, and high-income independent workers. But what does flexible employment mean in China? It means food delivery, express delivery, ride-hailing, domestic services, security work, cleaning services, live stream sales, temporary sales work, warehouse sorting, sporadic manual labor, and countless other forms of low-income, high-intensity, survival-driven physical labor, the kind of work now often described online by the new term ligong labor drudges. Many Americans say, I don't want to be tied to a company. Many Chinese people say, I simply cannot find a stable job. In America, some forms of flexible employment reflect professional freedom. In China, a vast number of flexible workers are members of a failed class thrown off the train by a deteriorating economy. These are two completely different worlds. Even more alarming, according to publicly available reports, by around 2026, the number of people engaged in flexible employment in China is expected to reach 320 million. In the construction industry alone, more than 17 million people lost their jobs in 2025. China's urban employed population is roughly 725 million, meaning that flexible employment already accounts for nearly 44% of the workforce. What does this mean? It means that nearly half of all workers have lost stable labor relationships and are living in an unpredictable future, surviving from one meal to the next, burdened with anxiety, uncertainty, and fear. Is this really an employment upgrade? No. This is a society-wide drift brought about by the collapse of the employment system. Food delivery workers are perhaps the most typical example. Some commentators claim that China's food delivery workforce has already exceeded 20 million people, while the market in reality only requires perhaps 4 to 5 million. So how do the excess workers survive? They survive through platform price cutting, through ruthless competition for orders, through extending working hours, through sacrificing their health, through working 18 hours a day, and through slowly destroying their bodies. Meanwhile, the platforms themselves take commissions of 20%, 25%, or even as high as 30%. These platforms control workers through algorithms, punish them for delays, and squeeze them through rigid rules. The state clearly knows all of this, yet chooses to tolerate it, turning a blind eye to injustice. Why? Because these platforms absorb vast numbers of unemployed people and help conceal the collapse of employment. Because, in terms of exploiting ordinary people, the platforms and the state are cut from the same cloth. Food delivery platforms may appear to be reservoirs of employment, but in reality, they are not. At best, they function only as temporary cushions against unemployment. The problem now is that even this cushion is beginning to leak. As society's overall purchasing power declines, how much longer can food delivery continue to expand? Will there still be room for 40 to 50 million domestic service workers? As middle-class household incomes decline, mortgage burdens intensify, children's educational expenses rise, and medical costs for aging parents increase, who will continue paying for cleaners, nannies, caregivers, and home services on a large scale? Consumption is steadily shrinking. And the demand base sustaining flexible employment will inevitably shrink and collapse alongside it. Thus, a vicious cycle begins to take shape. As formal jobs decline, more and more people flood into flexible employment. As the number of flexible workers surges, prices fall and incomes decline. As incomes decline, households become afraid to spend. As consumption falls, demand for delivery services, domestic work, retail, and ride-hailing declines. As demand declines, flexible jobs deteriorate further. And so, more people are swept into the enormous vortex of unemployment, underemployment, quasi-unemployment, and hidden unemployment unable to escape. This is not an economy undergoing adjustment. This is an entire society sinking. And inevitably, the social security crisis resurfaces. Many people say that large numbers of workers are now voluntarily refusing to contribute to social security. But in reality, it is not that they do not want to contribute, it is that they can no longer afford to. A food delivery rider, a ride-hailing driver, a street vendor, or a temporary worker already has unstable monthly income. After paying rent, food, transportation, children's expenses, and elderly care costs, what remains to contribute to Social Security? Many people are not unwilling to leave themselves a path for the future. Rather, they already find themselves with no path left today. What is the essence of Social Security? It is not a welfare gift falling from the sky. It is a system sustained through the continuous contributions of a population with stable employment. The money young people pay today supports the pensions of today's retirees. But now, as stable employment shrinks and flexible employment expands, interruptions in payment, underpayment, and non-payment inevitably increase. Meanwhile, the elderly population continues to grow. How long, then, can the pension reservoir continue to hold water? China's social security crisis is not something that will suddenly emerge in 2030. Its pressure has already become increasingly visible in the aftermath of the pandemic. In recent years, what has been called provincial pooling and national pooling is, in essence, an effort to draw from the wealthy to subsidize the poor. If county-level funds are insufficient, they are merged into city-level systems. If city-level funds are insufficient, they are merged into provincial systems. If provinces cannot sustain themselves, then nationwide pooling becomes the solution. But the problem is this: even the rivers with the most water are beginning to run dry. Where, then, can resources still be pooled from? Shanghai was once the strongest region in China in terms of social security. Wages were high. Contribution bases were high. Businesses were abundant. Fiscal strength was strong. Yet even a place like Shanghai is now beginning to experience mounting pressure. Why? Because of foreign capital withdrawal, economic slowdown, population aging, and a weakening of the contribution base. If even Shanghai, the wealthiest city in China, is beginning to struggle, how much more blood can still be drawn from it? And when Shanghai itself begins running short of blood, who will replenish Shanghai? Some people say fiscal subsidies can make up the difference. But where does fiscal money come from? Fiscal revenue comes from businesses, residents, consumption, land sales, debt issuance, and profits from state-owned enterprises. But today, corporate profits are plunging, the private sector is steadily declining, household consumption remains weak and continues to weaken, land finance has collapsed, local government debt stands on the edge of crisis, and even state-owned enterprises themselves are deeply indebted. Even giants such as PetroChina and China Tobacco have reported losses. In an economic depression where employment deteriorates, consumption collapses, and fiscal revenues weaken, money cannot simply appear out of thin air. So-called fiscal subsidies often amount to nothing more than pushing today's problems into tomorrow, transferring problems from one account to another, or shifting burdens from one region to another. And now, a historic transformation has taken place, the entire country is surviving on debt. Economist Li Xunlei recently published a long essay arguing that China's economy has gone through 4 major stages, from growth driven by foreign investment, to growth driven by exports, to growth driven by real estate, and now, to growth driven by government debt issuance. In one article, he revealed the underlying truth. And this is precisely what makes China's social security crisis truly frightening. It is not a single system crisis. Rather, it is the overlapping convergence of an employment crisis, a fiscal crisis, a demographic crisis, and a crisis of trust, all pressing against one another simultaneously. Originally, China was not without alternatives. More than 30 years ago, many scholars had already called for large-scale transfers of state-owned assets into social security accounts. If state-owned assets truly belonged to the people, then before the aging crisis arrived, allocating more state-owned equity and profits to supplement pension systems would have been both reasonable and practical. But what happened? Transfers of state-owned assets into social security accounts occurred only symbolically once or twice. As the holes in the pension system grew larger and larger, the Xi Jinping era not only remained indifferent, but instead accelerated the advance of the state advances while the private sector retreats. State-owned assets were increasingly transformed into instruments of state power, industrial control, and political engineering. As the state sector expanded and the private sector retreated, private businesses came under mounting pressure, platform companies faced political crackdowns, real estate was strangled by both policy and debt, and small and medium-sized businesses withered on a massive scale. Meanwhile, the state continued pouring hundreds of billions, even trillions, into subsidies for solar power, chips, electric vehicles, and now artificial intelligence. Some commentators have pointed out that in the past 2 years, total investment in the AI industry broadly defined has likely exceeded 10 trillion yuan annually, with the majority either directly funded by government spending or backed by implicit state guarantees. Xi Jinping is wagering the power of the entire nation on artificial intelligence in an effort to compete head-on with the United States. This is his obsession. It is also the inevitable manifestation of what might be called the Cultural Revolution gene of a generation shaped by Maoist political campaigns. What Xi seems not to realize is that artificial intelligence itself is one of the greatest destroyers of jobs, potentially unleashing an entirely new wave of unemployment. Yet Xi would rather allow AI to eliminate countless jobs than spend meaningful resources improving people's livelihoods, social security, or healthcare systems. Why? Because, in his view, for the sake of national strength, ordinary people must make sacrifices. Of course, a country should develop science and technology. But when ordinary people are already crushed under the immense burdens of employment insecurity, declining income, social security, healthcare, and retirement concerns, why do national resources continue to flow primarily toward high-risk, long-cycle strategic projects plagued by duplication, inefficiency, and severe overcapacity? Why do people's livelihoods always remain secondary? Doesn't the Chinese Communist Party constantly proclaim the people come first? Why, then, must the most basic survival needs and sense of security of more than 1 billion people forever yield to political fantasies of surpassing the United States, leading from afar, and overtaking on the curve? This question strikes directly at the essence of the CCP. The problem is not simply that its policy priorities are misplaced. Rather, the very foundation of the system itself is fundamentally anti-people and anti-human. Slogans such as people-centered development and putting the people first are little more than rhetoric designed to deceive the masses. The CCP has never truly regarded people as individuals with dignity and rights. Instead, it treats them as labor inputs, contributors to state funds, sources of taxation, objects of surveillance and stability maintenance, and cattle to be repeatedly milked for extraction. Nobel Prize-winning economists Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson introduced the concept of extractive institutions in their book Why Nations Fail. An extractive institution, they argue, is one in which a small ruling elite uses institutional arrangements to extract resources from society in order to preserve its own power, rather than creating opportunities for the majority, protecting rights, or expanding freedom. Viewed through this lens, China fits the concept with striking precision. The CCP is, in every meaningful sense, an extractive system. It extracts from farmers. It extracts from workers. It extracts from private businesses. It extracts from the middle class. It extracts from young people. It extracts from platform laborers. It extracts from mortgage slaves. It extracts from parents. It extracts from patients. It extracts from the elderly. It uses high housing prices to extract the future of an entire generation. It uses educational anxiety to drain family finances. It uses healthcare inequality to endanger the lives of ordinary people. It uses social security contributions to extract workers' hopes for retirement. It uses platform algorithms to exploit the bodies of delivery riders and drivers. But if the CCP or Xi Jinping personally deliberately governs in this way, does he not fear public rebellion? In Xi's view, he likely does not. Because he possesses both guns and knives. By guns, he holds military power, the ability to kill on a massive scale. Was the 1989 Tiananmen massacre in Beijing not a grim proof of this? By knives, he possesses the police apparatus, the power to arrest unarmed ordinary citizens at any moment. The suppression of the anti-bullying protests in Jiangyu, Sichuan, in August 2025, serves as yet another example among countless mass incidents that have been forcefully suppressed in China. The evidence stands beyond dispute. When the economy was growing rapidly, this extractive nature remained partially hidden beneath prosperity. People were exhausted, burdened, and struggling, but there still existed some hope for upward mobility. But now, amid economic stagnation, the collapse of real estate, declining consumption, and worsening employment conditions, the cruelty of extraction has become increasingly naked and unapologetic. Today, the most frightening reality in China is no longer the collapse of a single industry. It is that the entire society is being trapped inside a vicious cycle manufactured by an extractive system. Employment becomes unstable, incomes decline. As incomes decline, consumption contracts. As consumption contracts, businesses fail. As businesses fail, jobs disappear. As jobs disappear, more people flood into flexible employment. As flexible employment expands, interruptions in social security contributions increase. As social security pressure intensifies, future expectations deteriorate. As expectations worsen, consumption falls further. As consumption weakens, depression deepens. This is the vicious cycle of unemployment and economic depression. And not only is the CCP unwilling to break this cycle, it is actively deepening and intensifying it. The CCP refuses to acknowledge unemployment, so it repackages unemployment as flexible employment. The CCP refuses to acknowledge collapsing consumption, so it substitutes slogans about stimulating and boosting consumption in place of rising household incomes. The CCP refuses to acknowledge the social security crisis, so it responds with pooling mechanisms, delayed retirement, and so-called mutual elderly care to shift pressure elsewhere. The CCP refuses to acknowledge the destruction inflicted upon the private economy, yet continues to repeat slogans about the two unswervingly principles. The CCP refuses to acknowledge that its misguided industrial policies have produced massive resource misallocation, severe overcapacity, and a model in which government subsidies are used to dump excess production onto global markets, ultimately provoking comprehensive pushback from the